My name is Daniel, and for most of my life I prided myself on being someone who could read people well, someone who saw through false smiles and shaky intentions, someone who didn't get taken for a fool easily. But everything I thought I knew about trust fell apart the moment I realized the person I had let closest to me was the one I should have feared the most. I had spent years working my way through the chaos of bad relationships and near misses, and when I met Jessica, I thought that maybe, finally, I'd stumbled into something real, something clean, something that didn't come with a storm of red flags hidden behind charming words and rushed promises. We met during a volunteer cleanup at a local community park just outside of Seattle, and she was wearing this faded blue hoodie with paint on the sleeves and a smile that felt like it belonged in a better world. And I remember thinking that if someone could laugh that freely while picking up trash in the rain, maybe she was someone worth knowing. We started slow, as these things usually do when people are actually serious about doing it right, texting about shared playlists and late-night cravings for takeout, gradually moving toward weekends spent together doing the kinds of things couples in long-term relationships often take for granted: grocery runs, binge-watching shows we'd never finish, and waking up next to each other without needing to say anything to know it was okay. It wasn't perfect, and we weren't saints, but it felt safe and good and simple in the way people who've been through enough bad chapters recognize as worth holding on to. And over time, she became a part of my routine, my rhythm, my life. I introduced her to my mom, who rarely approved of anyone, and she surprised us both by saying Jessica felt different, like someone who didn't need to try too hard to fit in, and I clung to that, because I wanted it to be true more than I wanted to keep my guard up. For over a year, we built something that looked solid from the outside and felt peaceful from the inside. And I genuinely believed we were growing together, making plans for trips we might never take, but still enjoyed dreaming about, saving up for furniture we didn't yet need, but said we'd find a place for eventually. Then came the day that changed everything. A Tuesday afternoon when I got off work early and decided to surprise her at the apartment we'd been sharing for 6 months, thinking maybe I'd bring home her favorite Thai food, and we'd watch that documentary she kept pushing off for when we both had time. I didn't expect to walk in and find a man I'd never seen before standing shirtless in my kitchen drinking from my mug and acting like he'd done it 100 times before, and the moment he turned and saw me, the look on his face wasn't even panic. It was boredom, like I was the one who didn't belong there. Jessica walked out of the bedroom a second later, wearing my hoodie, and froze mid-step when she saw me standing in the doorway with the food still in my hands and disbelief crawling its way up my throat. There are moments in life that move in slow motion, not because of the actual passage of time, but because your mind refuses to catch up with what your eyes are seeing, and in that moment standing in the middle of our living room with Jessica staring at me like a deer caught in headlights and some stranger sipping coffee from the mug my sister gave me last Christmas, I couldn't find a single word that felt big enough to hold the weight of what I was feeling. Jessica didn't speak first, and neither did he, which only made the silence feel louder, like a storm building behind my ribs, and I stood there waiting for someone to say something, anything that would make it all make sense, because surely there had to be an explanation better than the one that was unfolding right in front of me. After what felt like a full minute of pure static in my brain, she finally opened her mouth and said my name like she was surprised I had come home early, as if that was the real problem, and not the fact that she was clearly sharing the space we built together with someone I'd never even heard of. She stammered something about how it wasn't what it looked like and how she was going to explain everything, but I didn't wait to hear the rest, because my feet were already moving backward and the door was already swinging shut behind me before my heart even had time to catch up with the fact that it was breaking. I walked for hours that day, no destination, no idea where I was going, just the sound of my footsteps and the ringing in my ears trying to drown out the sound of her voice, and the image of that guy's smug face burned into my memory like a scar I didn't ask for. I ended up crashing at my friend Tyler's place because going home didn't feel like home anymore, and when I told him what had happened, he didn't try to offer advice or tell me everything would be okay. He just handed me a beer and sat next to me in silence, and that was the first moment I realized that healing doesn't start with solutions, it starts with not being alone. The next morning, Jessica texted me a dozen times trying to get me to come back, trying to explain herself, trying to spin the situation into something less ugly than it was, and I didn't answer because nothing she could say would unsee what I saw or unfeel what I felt when I walked into that room. Eventually, she sent a long message detailing how it had started, how she didn't plan for it to go that far, how she thought it was just a temporary distraction during a rough patch, and how she still loved me and wanted to fix things, and all I could think while reading it was that someone who really loves you doesn't put you in a position to need that kind of explanation in the first place. I didn't respond to that message either, and instead spent the next few days bouncing between rage and heartbreak like a pendulum that refused to slow down, and no matter how many people told me I dodged a bullet or that I deserved better, all I could focus on was the fact that the person I had trusted most had been building a parallel life behind my back and pretending nothing was wrong. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop replaying everything from the past year, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things started to shift, and when her eyes stopped lighting up the way they used to, or when our conversations became more about logistics than laughter. And I hated how I started questioning every memory we had built, because betrayal has a way of poisoning even the good parts and leaving you unsure of what was ever real to begin with. I started remembering the nights she stayed late at work, and how she used to rush to the shower as soon as she got home, and how she suddenly had new inside jokes with people I'd never met, and now all of it made sense in the worst way possible, like someone handing you a puzzle piece that suddenly completes an image you didn't want to see. I talked to my mom a few days later, and even though I tried to keep my voice steady, she knew something was wrong immediately, and when I told her what happened, she didn't say, "I told you so." Even though she could have, because she had always been cautious around Jessica, she just said she was proud of me for walking away, instead of trying to fix something that was already shattered beyond repair. I moved the rest of my things out of that apartment over the weekend while Jessica was gone, because I couldn't stomach the idea of seeing her face or hearing her voice try to rewrite the past into something softer than what it was, and even though I tried to act calm, I felt like I was grieving a death the entire time, packing box after box with pieces of a life that had collapsed without warning. I left the keys on the counter and walked out without turning back, because some chapters deserved to end without a final conversation or a forced goodbye, and I knew that nothing she could say would make me feel better about what she had done or undo the months of deception that she so carefully stitched together behind my back. I stayed at Tyler's for a while longer, sleeping on his couch and doing my best to keep my mind distracted with work or music or reruns of shows I used to watch with her, which now felt like emotional landmines I couldn't seem to avoid, no matter how many times I told myself I was over it. There were nights when I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my chest tight and my hands clenched, and the image of her laughing with someone else in our kitchen playing on a loop in my mind, and during those moments I hated how powerless I felt, how stupid I felt for missing someone who had hurt me so badly, and how badly I wanted to erase every part of her from my memory just so I could feel like myself again. But healing doesn't happen on a schedule, and it doesn't care how logical you are or how much you know you deserve better, because emotions aren't math and grief doesn't follow rules. So I let myself sit in the pain without trying to rush through it, and I told myself that even if it took months or years, I would eventually get to the other side of this with my dignity intact and my heart still open. Eventually, I started getting used to the quiet again, not the kind that feels like absence, but the kind that brings clarity, the kind where you start hearing your own thoughts without someone else's voice in the background shaping them, and I realized how much of myself I had compromised trying to keep that relationship alive even when it was already bleeding out beneath the surface. I stopped blaming myself for not seeing the signs sooner, because hindsight is always perfect, and the truth is when you love someone you give them the benefit of the doubt, not because you're naive, but because you believe in their potential more than you fear their flaws, and while that kind of faith can be beautiful, it can also be your undoing if it's not returned with the same honesty. I started spending more time with people who didn't ask me how I was doing just to get the latest update, but who genuinely wanted to help me feel like myself again, and one of those people was my older cousin Mark, who invited me on a weekend fishing trip up north, not because I'm some outdoorsy guy, but because he knew I needed space to breathe, where no one was asking questions or analyzing every part of my breakup like it was some mystery that needed solving. We barely talked about Jessica during that trip, and that silence helped more than any long conversation, because it reminded me that I wasn't defined by what happened, and that my future didn't need to be narrated by the worst part of my past. Being on that lake watching the sunrise spill across the water with nothing but the sound of birds and the occasional splash from a line being cast reminded me that peace doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. It can be simple and quiet and steady, and that's exactly what I needed after months of emotional whiplash. When I came back from that trip, I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't reopen old wounds just because I missed the comfort of familiarity, and that meant blocking Jessica on everything, not out of spite but out of self-respect, because healing sometimes requires creating distance so wide that even nostalgia can't cross it. She still tried to reach out once or twice through mutual friends or emails that showed up in my spam folder, but I never responded because I had already learned that closure isn't something you wait for from the person who hurt you, it's something you give yourself the moment you decide you're worth more than what they gave you. I started rebuilding my life one small decision at a time, whether it was changing my routine or setting new boundaries or just getting through a day without thinking about her, and every time I chose myself over the past, it got a little easier to breathe. Some days were still hard, and there were moments when her memory hit me out of nowhere like a gust of wind carrying a scent I couldn't trace, and it would stop me in my tracks, but I stopped letting those moments define the rest of my day because pain is part of the process. But it doesn't get to be the whole story. After a while, the hurt started to soften around the edges, not because I forgot what happened or because I magically healed overnight, but because I stopped feeding the pain by revisiting conversations that never gave me answers and memories that only served to reopen wounds I had worked too hard to close. I started going back to the gym not just to stay in shape, but because I needed something physical to anchor me in the present and burn off the kind of mental fog that lingers when you've been emotionally blindsided and every run on the treadmill felt like a tiny act of rebellion against the version of me that had spent too many nights wondering what I could have done differently to make someone stay loyal. I also picked up reading again, something I used to love before relationships and work, and the general noise of adulthood made me forget that there's peace and silence and power in learning how to sit still with your own thoughts instead of trying to drown them out with distractions. One of the books I picked up talked about how people aren't afraid of being alone, they're afraid of being with themselves, and that line hit so hard I wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it to my bathroom mirror because I wanted to remember that learning to enjoy your own company is the first step to making sure you never settle for someone who doesn't see your worth. Around this time, my friend Claire invited me to a game night with a few people from her work, and I almost said no because socializing felt like too much energy, but something told me to go. And I'm glad I listened because even though nothing life-changing happened, it reminded me how good it feels to laugh with people who don't know your baggage and aren't trying to fix you, just happy to have you there. It was during one of those nights that I met someone named Alyssa who didn't ask me what I did for a living or where I went to school right away, but instead asked me what my favorite childhood memory was, and we ended up talking for over an hour about the weirdest things like favorite cereal as a kid or the songs our parents used to play in the car on road trips, and it felt effortless in a way that conversations hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't trying to impress her or hide anything about myself, and she didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile, just someone interesting who had stories worth telling. And that alone was enough to make me think that maybe there was life after heartbreak, not in some dramatic love at first sight way, but in the quiet realization that not everyone is going to leave you questioning your value. I didn't rush anything with Alyssa because I wasn't ready for another relationship, and thankfully she didn't expect me to be, and for the first time I understood that connections can exist without pressure, and that some people come into your life not to rescue you, but to remind you that you were never truly lost. Over the next few weeks, I continued to rebuild my life not as an attempt to erase what had happened, but as a way to reintroduce myself to the parts of me that had been put on pause while I was trying to hold together a relationship that was already unraveling behind my back, and it amazed me how quickly healing could accelerate when you stop trying to justify someone else's choices and start accepting that some people will disappoint you no matter how much love you give them. I began making small changes that felt significant, like waking up earlier and cooking breakfast instead of grabbing something on the go, or walking to the coffee shop on weekends instead of ordering delivery, because those moments of intention gave me a sense of control that I had lost when everything fell apart, and that control reminded me I was still capable of building a life I enjoyed even without someone else's hand in mine. Alyssa and I continued to talk, mostly casual conversations and the occasional coffee run, and it felt refreshing to be seen without being judged. To share parts of my story without feeling like I needed to censor the messy details to make them more palatable or dramatic, just to hold someone's attention. One afternoon we sat in the park watching a dog chase its own tail, and she looked at me and said, "You don't seem angry anymore." And I realized in that moment that she was right. Not because I had forgotten what happened or because I had forgiven Jessica, but because I had finally stopped carrying the anger like a shield and started allowing peace to take up that space instead. I told her that letting go wasn't about pretending it didn't hurt, but about choosing to stop letting that pain steer my decisions and define the way I saw people moving forward, and she nodded in that way people do when they know exactly what you mean without needing a long explanation. Around that time, Jessica sent one final message through a friend asking if we could meet just to talk, and while part of me was curious to hear what she had to say, I knew deep down that nothing she could tell me would change the way things ended or make the betrayal sting any less. So I declined not out of spite or resentment, but because I didn't need a final conversation to validate the closure I had already given myself. That decision felt like the final thread being cut, and for the first time in months, I didn't wake up wondering what she was thinking or whether she regretted what she'd done. I simply woke up, made my bed, and went about my day like a person who had finally stepped out of the shadows of someone else's choices. It wasn't dramatic or emotional or something worthy of a movie scene, but it was real and honest, and that was enough because healing rarely looks like fireworks. It often looks like routine, like quiet mornings, like being able to sit with yourself without flinching at the silence. As more time passed, the moments of reflection started to become less about Jessica and more about me because I realized that while she had been a significant part of my story, she was no longer the author of it, and I was no longer interested in editing my memories to make sense of a chapter that simply ended with betrayal instead of resolution. I started investing more in my friendships, especially the ones that had always been there but maybe didn't get as much attention when I was too busy trying to be someone else's emotional anchor, and those people reminded me who I was before the relationship, and, more importantly, who I was capable of becoming after it. I stopped being afraid of going places where we had been together and started reclaiming those spaces as my own because I refused to let the past keep dictating where I could feel joy or peace or comfort, and that kind of healing felt powerful even in the smallest ways, like ordering the drink she used to hate just because I liked it, or sitting on the bench we once shared and realizing the view hadn't changed even if everything else had. Alyssa remained a steady presence in my life, never asking for more than I could give, but always showing up with kindness and patience, and I admired how she didn't try to fix me or push me toward anything, but instead held space for me to grow on my own, and that kind of support is rare, especially when most people expect progress to come with visible milestones and emotional declarations. We went to a local street fair one weekend, and as we wandered between food trucks and music stands, I noticed how easy it was to be around her, how natural it felt to laugh again, without that voice in my head whispering doubts or comparisons, and it hit me that maybe the right people don't erase your pain, they just make it easier to carry. I still had moments of sadness, the kind that sneak up on you during slow songs or in familiar smells, but I stopped seeing those emotions as setbacks and started treating them like echoes, reminders of where I'd been and how far I'd come, and there was something quietly empowering about knowing I could feel all of that without letting it drown me. I journaled more in those months than I had in years, not because I was trying to document everything, but because I wanted to capture the little things, the subtle shifts in my perspective, the way my voice stopped shaking when I talked about what happened, and the way I started dreaming again, not about someone else, but about my own future. I didn't know exactly what I wanted that future to look like yet, but I knew what I didn't want, and that clarity alone felt like the kind of foundation I could build on brick by brick, day by day, without rushing toward a destination just for the sake of moving forward. One thing I started to understand with more clarity was that forgiveness isn't always about giving someone else peace. Sometimes it's about choosing to stop letting anger rent space in your head, because there comes a point where carrying resentment feels heavier than simply letting go of the need to make someone pay for what they did. And that realization changed the way I looked at Jessica, not with sympathy or nostalgia, but with neutrality, as just another person who made a mistake that no longer needed to shape my identity. I stopped replaying our arguments in my head and trying to find the moment where I might have saved things, because I realized that someone who cheats isn't reacting to your flaws, they're responding to their own emptiness. And you don't fix that by being better, you fix that by walking away and making space for someone who doesn't need a lesson in loyalty. Alyssa and I grew closer over time, not through grand romantic gestures or passionate declarations, but through small things like sending each other music or sharing quiet moments at the end of long days, and those ordinary interactions reminded me that real connection isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just consistently kind. We talked about everything from childhood fears to future dreams, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, not because I felt pressured, but because I felt safe. And there's a kind of magic in realizing you can be fully yourself without bracing for judgment. There was a night when we sat in her apartment watching some documentary neither of us really cared about, and I looked over and saw her fast asleep with her head resting against the couch cushion, and I remember thinking not about love or commitment, but about trust, and how rare it is to find someone whose presence makes you feel calm without needing to prove anything. I wasn't sure where things with her would go or if we'd ever define it with labels, but for once I didn't need certainty to feel content, because healing had taught me that sometimes the most important part of moving forward is learning how to exist in the now without constantly chasing what comes next. My life wasn't perfect, and I still had bad days where old emotions surfaced or triggers reminded me of the past. But those moments didn't derail me anymore. They just passed through like brief weather systems I knew how to handle, and that resilience felt more valuable than any apology I never got. I had become someone who could sit with discomfort and not try to numb it, someone who could look back without wanting to go back, and someone who finally understood that closure is something you create, not something you wait for. And the more I leaned into that truth, the lighter I felt, and the more room I had to focus on what truly mattered, which was not what had happened to me, but who I chose to become because of it. Looking back now, I don't see that experience as a failure or a tragedy, but as the catalyst that forced me to stop living on autopilot and start asking real questions about who I was and what kind of life I wanted to create from the ground up without leaning on someone else's version of happiness or confusing comfort with connection. Because as painful as that betrayal was, it pushed me toward a version of myself I may never have found if everything had stayed easy. I learned how to be alone without being lonely, how to find joy in small things again, like late-night drives with no destination or cooking a new recipe that turned out terrible but still felt like a win because it was mine and I wasn't doing it to impress anyone. I stopped chasing closure from the people who hurt me and instead started building peace brick by brick, decision by decision, day by day, in ways that only I could see and only I could feel. And that peace didn't come from pretending everything was fine. It came from admitting when it wasn't and still showing up for myself anyway. I don't know if I'll ever run into Jessica again, and honestly, it doesn't matter, because I've reached a place where seeing her wouldn't shake me. It would just remind me how far I've come and how grateful I am that what once felt like an ending turned out to be a beginning in disguise. Alyssa is still in my life, and what we have isn't defined by labels or expectations, but by presence and mutual respect. And if it grows into something more, then I'll be thankful. But even if it doesn't, I'll still be grateful for the reminder that good people exist, and that not everyone is going to leave you with broken pieces to pick up alone. If you're listening to this and you're sitting in the middle of your own heartbreak, wondering if it's ever going to stop hurting, or if you'll ever feel like yourself again, let me tell you that you will. Not because time magically heals everything, but because you will wake up one day and decide that your peace matters more than your pain, and that's the day everything begins to shift. You won't forget what happened, and you shouldn't, but you'll stop letting it control your thoughts, and you'll realize that healing doesn't mean you never think about it again. It just means you can remember without breaking, and that kind of freedom is worth every tear you cried on the way there. In the end, you don't need the person who hurt you to understand what they did. You just need to understand that you deserved better, and that you still do. And when you finally believe that with your whole heart, the world starts to feel like home again in a way that no betrayal could ever steal from you.